started in 1979 in Crawford County, Pennsylvania. Actually, I had an interest in it when I was in seminary in Chicago, because one of the churches where I did field education had a great number of people in the community who had alcohol or drug problems or mental health problems, and they would frequently walk into the church asking for help of one sort or another. I had no idea what to do with them. Fortunately, I did know that there was a group called AA that existed, and so I called two gentlemen on the phone, listed in the phone book, and they were very gracious and came by and explained to me a lot of things that I could do and don't do. They spent a couple hours with me just explaining what AA was and what kinds of things they did and how often their meetings in the Chicago area were. And I was very grateful that they were willing to spend that time to help me better understand what I could do. That was sort of the beginning of my interest, and then when I came back to Western Pennsylvania, I was trying to figure out what to do, and my aunt said, well, I can get you a job interview at this detox unit. They need somebody to work the midnight shift. So I went over there and interviewed, and I had a 3-hour interview because I was the very first person they ever hired who wasn't in recovery. And they wanted to make sure that they figured they were taking a risk doing that, so they wanted to get to know me real well. And that was October of 1979. And so I've been involved in one way or another ever since. No, I never considered that God loved a person with a substance use disorder less than he did anyone else. I remember a long time ago, when I first got into drug and alcohol, there was a man named Father Joseph Martin who did a lot of speaking and did films on alcoholism particularly. And he said in one of his talks that God listens very intently at the desperate prayers of alcoholics. That they may, with a great deal of desperation, pray that God save them from their situation. And he says, indeed, God is answering, and God's trying whatever God can do to send people their way to help. But those desperate prayers are listened to because God does deeply love them and hope for them to return as a child of God.
Well, ultimately, the answer, with they are that direct, that's rare that's that direct. But the answer is yes. A lot of times it involves more listening and trying to discern if there's an obstacle for folks to accept and receive that love from God. I'll share passages from them, especially passages like Romans 8, where it talks about how nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither height nor depth or angels or principalities. And I'll say, so is drugs or alcohol in that list? Will that separate you from the love of God that he has for you? Will addiction separate you from the love of God? And the answer is no. So God definitely still loves you. God cares for the poor. God cares for the brokenhearted. So I share some of the scripture and share my own experience and how I have received God's love in my own recovery process and had those wounds healed in myself and received God's love and forgiveness. And so it's a dialogue. And again, it's a lot of times it's a process. It takes time for that healing to occur, especially when it's involves crimes, when it involves the manipulation of loved ones, so it takes time to really receive that forgiveness that God has for us. And so we try to work, and the church, I think, as we're trying to work with people, to just support and love and listen with people who are in that process. And it's not always a once and done. It's a over and over and reinforcing and hearing and receiving that story again and again. And again, that proclamation along with demonstrating our love and our forgiveness for those who are struggling.
Well, not all of them are fully conscious of that shame or guilt. You have to understand that shame and guilt's coming from external sources, maybe family or friends or even neighbors who are telling them things because of their generally negative antisocial behavior that the alcohol or drug use produces in them. And some deal with it in a whole different sort of way. Some simply deny that anything anybody's telling them is true. And some people deal with it by, I used to ask people if they believed in God. And a lot of times the answer was no. And I often wondered why. And they said, well, God was the source of their guilt. That's what they believed. And so if you get rid of God, you get rid of your guilt. But at some point in time, people do become, even for short periods of time, very conscious that they have a serious problem. And so all that shame and guilt comes rushing back, almost like a tidal wave. And they begin to understand that they either have to do something about it, or sometimes they just feel so helpless and hopeless that they decide there is nothing they can do, that this is just their normal life. And it's a part of trying to get them to understand, in order to get into recovery, that it doesn't have to be this way. And it's not always easy for people to know, but you will get family members, for example, who give you some insight into the person. They may say, he's a really nice guy, or he's very friendly, or they'll talk about his good qualities, which in many parts of his life may very well be true. But when the substance is added to their life, then a lot of bizarre, socially unacceptable behavior comes forth, and that's what a lot of people see or judge the person on exclusively, without really getting to know who they are as a person, particularly as their family sees them. which is part of the problem the family may be having, is they see the good and the bad, and they just want the good to be there all the time, and sometimes there are denials about the unacceptable behavior. So we have to look at, over the years I've had people who, not a lot, but people who were very faithful, dedicated church members, is that nobody realized that they had a problem with alcohol or a problem with pain medications. And a lot of times they would get treatment without ever telling anybody in the church that's what they did. People noticed an improvement in their behavior overall, but they never knew why. So it's, we can sometimes judge people on those very thin slices of their life that we see, rather than seeing who they actually have been and potentially what they could become. Well, I think they need to spend a little bit of time educating themselves about the nature of addiction, and particularly to help church members and elders understand that they probably have a lot of people who are already in their congregations who are struggling with these problems. They may not be dealing with a substance use problem themselves, but they may have family members. They may have grandchildren, children, nephews, nieces, who have this problem. And they're not talking to anybody in the church about it because they themselves are full of shame and guilt about it, because they are afraid people might think of them, well, you're not a very good parent, or you're not a very good grandparent because you let this happen. But congregations need to be open to hear what people are saying. They need to talk about it. Pastors need to preach about it, to let people know about, we're not here to let everybody know how good we are, but that we're here so that God's goodness can work through us.